space is now the actual Blackfriars stage and not the Masonic building, which has obviously different acoustic qualities, this being a theater, that being a room. The kinds of things that tend to happen in a theater space that do not happen in a room such as that, for one thing, is the fact that we have audience in the balcony all the way around. That means that Richard cannot be as introverted as looking down, because the people upstairs are getting the top of my head, which, while certainly beautiful, is not what they're paying for. So that involves a lot more looking up and higher delivery of the lines in terms of the places I look, the places I take my time to think. And this, in fact, does inform the performance in subtle ways. It informs the gait, for one thing, because in trying to balance out that weight, looking up higher means that I have to balance it farther back, and therefore informs the way that I'm moving in a lot of ways that you can see when you watch the actual presentation of the monologue. Another thing that's important in a theater space is projection, obviously. In general, you're always trying to fill the room you're in, and in the case of the Masonic building, talking as loud as I talk in here is liable to hurt people's ears, whereas in here, it has to be done just to fill the space so the people in the back seats can hear as well as the people here in the front seats. Other things that we have done is that we have changed a section of the blocking. We decided that this section of the blocking was not necessarily as directly tied to the language as we would have liked it. So what we did, instead of a semicircle around the stage, we instead had a turning around of Richard in which he was trying to show off his deformity, trying to show off his body. For me, the impetus behind this movement was simply trying to get the audience to look at the things that were quote-unquote wrong with Richard's body. And in so doing, it's a lot more directly related to the audience. The original, as we talked about before, impetus behind making that turn was the idea of a dog guarding his territory. And we decided that we still wanted to keep that sort of animalistic quality, that he is sort of going around an area, but at the same time, the kinds of things he is doing is trying to win the audience over to his side in some ways. So it felt more apt, I guess, or more accurate to try to show off the body and say, you know, look how bad I've got it, kind of thing, as opposed to trying to keep the audience out by patrolling, you know, establishing a line between the two of us. Sort of similar concept that when you start thinking about the fourth wall and how some theaters attempt to draw a line between the end of the proscenium and the audience out of the seats. Another thing that is different from the previous presentations of the monologue is the last four lines, which we added. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the decisions we made with those. The first two lines, why I in this week in piping time of peace have no delight to pass away the time, we were trying to go with the idea that Richard is falsely being self-pitying, that he is sarcastically self-pitying, as it were. Oh, woe is me, I have nothing to do. And there's a turning point, a beat, as it's often called in the theater, when he says the word unless. And you'll notice in the presentation that I stop and plant, stay still. And I say unless to spy my shadow in the sun and descant on my own deformity. The idea here again is to try to incorporate the idea that the king is that way and that Richard is plotting. This creates a very sort of sinister tone, and because of the steps that we've tried to do to integrate the audience throughout the rest of the monologue, it sort of implicates the audience, I think, in the idea that, okay, now we're going to go over here and kill that guy. Again, in trying to sort of keep with the animal nature of Richard, I think that this particular motivation for what I'm doing, this particular drive, is more powerful for what we're trying to do, though not necessarily obviously the only way to do it. And the reason I say that is because it gives Richard a sort of predatory nature. So he sort of comes off as, you know, a hunting dog, and he's like, and there's the cat. So that's sort of the implication that can be carried out through our little metaphor. And again, and I feel important to emphasize this, that in trying to do animal work and apply animal work to presentation of a part on stage, that the idea is not that somebody in the audience watches this and necessarily comes away and says, wow, that guy was a spider, or that guy was a panther or a cat or whatever, you know. The idea is that we're using the natural world as influence for our sort of, you know, artistic medium. So the idea is not necessarily to make you think, well, that guy is playing Richard III as a dog. The idea is that you see these things that are similar in some way, or at least informed by the concept of how a dog behaves, and you get the sort of the same kind of emotion or same kind of feeling when you do see that animal doing similar behavioral patterns.
That's good. Just one more thing for me to edit in later.
Sure.
When you say, you mentioned the unless I spy my shadow in the sun, you forgot to mention that this refers to the metaphor at the beginning of the line. I want you to explain that, explain that we decided that sun is again sun as in, as he referred to in the first line, the son of York.
Okay, so, because I mentioned the king being over there, but I didn't necessarily go to that. Mm-hmm. So do you want me to redo that section, or do you want me to just say the part about that and have you edit it between?
Let's redo that section.
Okay,
it'll be easier.
What were we talking about at first?
At first we were talking, well, just to start on the last 4 lines and how unless, no, it was before that. That is false pity.
Okay, the false pity one. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, we need you to settle before. Is he in the shot? No.
The second half of the section talks about unless to spy my shadow in the sun. Again, in theater, when we talk about a beat, what we're referring to is a moment where the thought process that the actor or the character, if you will, is going through changes, where what he's focusing on or thinking about or wanting becomes something else, or builds into something else even, or even becomes a greater form of that thing that he's already leaning towards. Okay, I need to start that over. I've got myself wrapped in too many words. Sorry. In the final 2 lines of this section, which we've added, starts with the word unless. And in the theater, when we use the word beat, what we're referring to is a shift in the character's motivation, the impetus that is driving what he is saying. And the word unless usually signifies a beat, and in this case we feel that it does. Richard stops, plants himself, takes a moment, says, unless to spy my shadow in the sun. And this is a reference to the beginning of the monologue when he refers to the king as the son of York. It's a double entendre, if you will. And in this case, we are referring to that again. He looks back in the direction of the king. And he says, unless to spy my shadow in the sun and descant on mine own deformity. The idea is basically that Richard is implicating the audience in his plot. He says, man, it's awful, the situation I'm in. It really is a terrible place to be in. He pulls the audience in, at least hopefully, to agree with him. And then he says, although there is one thing I could do. I can't really learn to play the violin. I can kill the king, though. Wouldn't that be fun? Let's go. It's a very sinister moment, I think, because in some ways it implicates the audience in this idea that we're going to go take the throne together and let's see what happens. That is not to say that Richard fails to continue being the standard Shakespearean villain, so to speak, but he does bring the audience along for the ride at the very least, even if they're not necessarily thinking that he's in the right in so doing.